And now I would like to make a short introduction into the last part of our today's ceremony. So among all the nice words which starts with letter C, such as chocolate, cocoa, or candies, there are also two which also start with the letter C and can make us a little bit frightened: crisis and COVID. But let's be honest, one of the goals of what we are doing as researchers is finding solutions to critical situations. I'm sure everyone is already looking forward to the presentations ahead, so I'm passing the screen to Professor Tonianowicz, chair of the panel Labor Laws Resilience in Time of Crisis and Beyond. Hello, Bristol.
Hello, Poland. Hello, Warsaw and Lodz. Thank you very, very much to Guy for that superb review of the LLRN history. And I think we're all very much conscious today that we're trying to carry that forward. It's my great pleasure to introduce this plenary session on labour laws, resilience in times of crisis and beyond. And as Guy said, we try not to be a particularly hierarchical organisation. This is our one plenary session, and it is, very valuable for us. But it's a crucial set of themes that we hope will continue to be explored throughout the next 2 days of the conference and all the various sessions that are to come. So I want to welcome 3 exceptional speakers who will discuss the potential for labour law to address and perhaps even transcend our current crises. And we wouldn't limit that definition of crisis merely to the pandemic. We see these crises potentially as arising beyond that. So if I may, we're going to start with Tamas Gulaveri, who is a professor at Pázmány Péter Catholic University in Budapest in Hungary. And we have to thank him also as a member of this conference's scientific committee. Tamas will speak on labour law and transformation. Welcome, Tamas. It's over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. I would like to welcome all labour lawyers around the world sitting in front of the computers instead of preparing for the welcome dinner. So first of all, let me send big hugs to the Polish organizing team for their amazing work, what they have done in recent weeks and months. You can see the title of and the question of my presentation, but the post-socialist labor law model, does it still exist in 2021? Łukasz has already mentioned and stressed that this is the first time that LLRN is organized in Central and Eastern European region. So the Polish organizing team and myself, we thought to give you a bit of an insight of our special labor law world. How is post-socialist labor law? Does it still exist in 2021? And more importantly, why is it so? You may remember Ever Given, the huge cruise which was stuck in the Suez Canal in March. And I will use this picture to raise the same issue. Are we stuck in our present problems in the region? If it is so, how can we dig out ourselves? So I'm looking forward to answer this question. And in answering this question, I will use 2 tracks. The first track will be features of our labor law model. 3 features will be used. The first one is the outstanding role of statutory law. The second is lack of effective collective dimension. And the third is the limited effect of international standards. I know, it's a huge group of countries. So post-socialist labor law may cover from Russia to China, from Vietnam to all around. So I will focus on Central and Eastern European problems. And even within this group, it's quite a colorful group. So any generalization is not without mistakes and exceptions. Please keep this in mind. So my first track will be 3 features, and the second track will be 2 examples from the post-socialist labor law world. The first example will be atypical work relations, and the second one will be the way how we handled the pandemic. Before I go to the first feature, I would like to take you to a similar virtual tour, what you have been taken by the film, image film at the beginning, but with some scientific remarks. If you look at our history and you look at Warsaw, the biggest city in Central and Eastern Europe, first we have to start with the splendor of the past and the Middle Ages, when we were in many ways very similar to the West. To Western European big cities. But even at that time, of course, there were many international influences. We were in the grip of many powers, like the Turkish Empire, the Habsburgs, the Swedish Kingdom, and of course, Russia. If you look at the second phase, another phase of Warsaw, you have seen beautiful pictures of the university. Then you see the skyscrapers built after EU accession, and this shows you an economic boom, and again, the wish to catch up with the West and be similar to... Do you see my slides? Not anymore. Thank you. But now you do. Okay, you hear me. Excellent. So you can see the skyscrapers and the economic boom after EU accession. But we have another phase, of course. This is the another phase of the glorious past. This building was built in the 1950s. That's a gift from the Soviet Union. And the Polish people could decide in between 2 kinds of gifts, one a metro line in Warsaw or this building. And of course, the center, the Communist parties, they decided that this culture of Palace of Culture is the best for Polish people, much better than a metro line. So if you consider all these 3 pictures, then you see the different influences from the East and from the West. And now I would like to move to the first feature. I promised 3 features, and the first one is centralized, very much centralized regulation. So I would like to stress that statutory law has an outstanding importance in the region, and this centralized regulation is coming from the political center. So the role of statutory law is increasing all around the world. However, in our region, this is the topmost source, obscuring all other sources, like the collective bargaining part. The first specialty within this centralized regulation is the very existence of labor codes. Labor codes in all countries in the region. These labor codes were originally copied from the Soviet labor code of 1922. Contents of these labor codes have changed, apparently, but the form labor code has remained with us, which is a distinctive feature of the region from many others. This is my favorite Soviet heritage, I have to say, because it makes legislation much easier and more effective. Just think of the implementation of EU directives and also checking your own rights. And labor codes also mirror the formal importance of employment rights in the society, which is also good heritage. If we stay at central regulation, then you have to keep in mind that we always had to behave ourselves in our history. Personally, I was a pioneer, like one of them, in the 1970s, so I learned to expect orders from above, and I knew exactly how to behave. This explains our centralized labor law rulemaking, and this is very deeply rooted in the society, and explains the weakness of other sources, like the collective dimension. So it's not a surprise that everything is decided above, in the parliament, in the governmental parties, in the government. So in the labor market, all the actors, they keep their eye on the legislator. They always look at the legislator. Employees, trade unions, and employers, they keep an eye on the legislator all the time, and all we do is reacting what's happening in the center. So it's kind of responsive model to what's coming from the political center and through statutory law. So law is the number one model, but now I have to move on to the second feature, which is powerless collective dimension. So the second feature is that we cannot expect too much from collective labor law. It is beautifully regulated in the labor codes of our countries, but they barely have any effect on labor market practice. So when we think of the weak organizations, before 1990, we had one communist trade union. Everybody had to be a member of, like my parents, they had to join. And we had only one employer, that was the state. Can you properly hear me? Okay. After 30 years, we have weak and declining trade unions and formal employer organizations. So basically everything, almost everything is missing or partly existing what we need for an effective collective bargaining and negotiation system. We don't really have tradition, know-how, mass support, political will, financial and intellectual background. So we are very, very bad in general in organization. So it's not a surprise that coverage by collective agreements is very low. It is a decentralized system of collective bargaining, concentrated at company level. So sector level is practically missing, with some exceptions. So coverage is very low and even declining in many countries. But what is going on at national level? Is it better? At national level, we also have toothless national dialogue. It wanted to be a lion, but it basically became and remained a cat. So I move to the third feature, which is struggling with international standards. The third feature is our special story with international labor standards. As it could have been seen at Warsaw highlights, international influence was always very important. So we do not have the tradition in collective labor law, but we have the tradition in copying foreign samples. Yesterday, we had to copy the Soviet labor code. Today, we have to copy EU directives. Imagine, we had some 3 years to implement the entire social acquis of the EU. I was taking part in the negotiations, and it was such a rush. In 3 years, the entire acquis, which was elaborated in decades. So we have the experience in that. And we are very good students. We are eminent students. We have done the job because it was perceived as an entry ticket to the club. But time is passing by, and some clouds are appearing in the sky in the face of minimum harmonization strategies, more and more infringement procedures. Think of termination of judges in Poland or Hungary and other countries. So in general, I would call this, there is an increasing harmonization hangover, and it is spreading. But what is going on with the standards in practice? I think that practice hardly changes. We do what our parents did. We follow our samples, what we learned. So the main problem is the moderate effect of international standards on everyday practice. We have always been very good at writing law books and much worse in following them. So international practices of practice as an impact, as a result of international standards, is moving a little bit upwards. It's getting better very slowly. Like when you are walking up in the staircase in the Vatican Museum, as you can see on the picture. So I have talked about three features. These three features were statutory law, collective dimension, and international standards. Let me give you two examples very briefly. The first example is about the atypical work relations and the atypical world. This is regulation and spread, how it happens in practice. We have regulated in these countries as a result of EU harmonization mostly. We have regulated many new forms of atypical employment relationship. They look very nice in the labor code, but they hardly exist in practice. There are some exceptions, but in general, they are more present in the labor code than in the labor market. So there is no other part of the world where the standard employment relationship would be so stable and popular as in our region. So the EU directives have been implemented. We are good, eminent students, but they have hardly any effect in practice. So if we do not have many atypical employment relationships, so basically we have only typical ones? No, because cheap employment is a key challenge at this economic periphery of the EU. So there must be ways out of expensive employment, but these ways are going out through the loopholes, like in the small gates in Angkor Wat. It is not employment contracts and not atypical employment contracts, but rather like undeclared work, for example, Romania, typically, fixed-term contracts. Polish colleagues have written a lot about this. Casual work, like in Hungary and in Croatia, and bogus self-employment all around. So this is a flourishing world exiting through these legal loopholes, living in peace with typical employment, thereby they ensure cheap flexibility in the labor markets, but not through atypical employment contracts. And my second example and the last example, getting to the end, this is coping with the COVID, how we handled the pandemic. We handled the pandemic as we have done always with everything. We followed our basic instincts and we behave as always. What does it mean? It means that we are waiting for the answer from the political center, waiting for the laws which come from one day to the other. During the pandemic, I started my everyday at 7 o'clock, making a coffee and checking out the official journal, what the government and the parliament, what the government did last night. So basically, there are no collective negotiations. We wait for the answers from the political center and keep murmuring about the crazy laws. So basically, it's like a telephone center, dispatcher center. The government is always telling you what to do, and you either follow or not, but it comes good or bad, but that's what's happening. Personally, I thought at the beginning of the pandemic that this would be the golden age for mediators, and I was totally wrong. There is no dialogue at all at the labor market. There is no dialogue at national level, some reacting to the laws, of course, of the government, what they have made wrong. There is no basically any dialogue at sector level. Sector level is totally missing. And some company level agreements, especially at multinational and big firms who have practice on that. But basically this is far from the ideal form of dialogue. So what we do, we behave as always. And now I arrived at my conclusions. My question was at the beginning, if you may remember, that do we still have a post-socialist labor law model? Does it still exist in 2021? And I think that there are there are common features of these general characteristics, common features of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Yes, these features are the absolutely outstanding importance of the political center and its decisions through statutory laws, very bad organization, low level of the collective dimension, especially 2/+ partners at national level, and basically very low effectiveness of international standards, and things are very slowly changing. So yes, we have post-socialist features. Is it still a separate model? I think it is rather a wannabe West model. We always want to be another model, and we cannot be that model, so we are another model. So basically, the post-socialist labor law world is very responsive, it's very open, and it's in a constant state of catching up. We are always the second dog. We always want to catch the first one, and we hardly do. So arriving to the original picture, you may remember Ever Given, which was stuck in the Suez Canal. So we are kind of stuck, in my opinion, and my colleagues will debate with me in the coming days, I'm sure. But we keep working, keep digging these screws out to get to nicer ports with palm trees. But will we ever reach there? Will it be ever given? I told you that we all have to sit in front of the computers instead of preparing for dinner and with a nice glass of wine. So I would like to use this opportunity to just to smell a little bit this nice cup of Hungarian wine. And na zdrowie. Thank you for your attention.
We're going to pass over to Professor Judy Fudge from McMaster University in Canada, who is as well known and loved in Europe as she is in North America. And I know that fellow New Zealanders were delighted to welcome her there too. She is a leading scholar on many issues, including equality law, migration, and collective labor law. It's a great pleasure to welcome her here. Judy, it's over to you.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank the local organizing committee, in particular, Piotr, Lucas, Marta, and Isabella, and the International Organizing Committee for all of your great efforts in mounting the LLRN5 under such challenging conditions. I'd also like to thank Guy for his inspiring history of the LLRN, and Tanya for chairing this session and her welcome. Congratulations to Monica and Matthew for the recognition of your great contributions to the field. It is a pleasure to follow Tamas, and it's a pleasure not to be the last speaker because you'll have a great speaker, Pammy, with wonderful slides, and she's going to tell us about a part of the world we need to spend much more time listening to. So I'm very pleased about that. I'd also like to say hello to all my labor law friends and colleagues around the globe and wish you a safe passage through this pandemic. My remarks are inspired by the title of this panel, which is Labor Law's Resilience in Times of Crisis and Beyond. It provoked me to think about the role of labor law and social change. In medical terms, a crisis is the point in a disease when an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. In the context of socio-ecological systems in which humans and nature are strongly connected, resilience is associated with sustainability in the face of constant change. Resilience involves two kinds of responses to that change: adaptation, by which the system seeks to maintain the same structure or shape, and transformation, in which the system moves from an untenable state to a new stable state. In this latter sense, resilience is not a matter of bouncing back, but rather of springing forward. What interests me is whether we are at a crisis in the sense of a tipping point in which the old is dying and the new is waiting to be born. I do not doubt that our societies are resilient. My question is whether resilience will take an adaptive or transformative form, and what labor law can contribute to social transformation. I ask this now because our starry-eyed faith in the legitimacy and value of the neoliberal political order and globalized financial capitalism has finally begun to dim. By neoliberal political order, I mean the idea that markets should be unfettered by political or social constraint. Financialization refers to the regime of accumulation that succeeded Fordism as profit generation shifted from industrial production to interest, dividends, and capital gains. In the 1970s, faced with increased international competition and domestic demands for shareholder return, American manufacturers offshored production and controlled foreign supply chains to cut down costs, including labor costs. Financialization, globalization, and deregulation were strategies intended to restore profits to the levels seen during the 1950s, the heyday of managed capitalism. The birth of autonomous labor law emerged at the end of World War I. It was fueled by the Depression, and it was firmly institutionalized in liberal capitalist democracies by the end of World War II. Labor law was propelled by collective action, primarily by industrial. The existence of socialism as a real alternative was critical for the class compromise embodied by labor law, which sought to balance the prerogatives of private property with the protection of labor. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1991, there was no longer any need for liberal capitalist democratic states to maintain the class compromise that labor law historically embodied. According to the logic of neoliberalism, labor law was simply a protectionist constraint that interfered with innovation in free markets. The new mantra was that a rising tide will lift all boats. Inequality was simply an acceptable trade-off for growth. This economic wisdom was widely accepted as reality. However, the financial crisis of 2008 shook our overweening confidence in free markets, and doubts began to creep in. Even after the financial bailout, income and wealth inequality within and between countries continued dramatically to increase. Just before the pandemic, if we can recall that period, in 2020, the publication Trading for Development in the Age of Global Value Chains, the World Bank reported that supply chains have not been a conduit for value capture by either capital or labor in the global south or labor in the global north. Most value was extracted by large multinational companies headquartered in the global north. Wealth has not been trickling down. It is being absorbed and consolidated by sponges at the top. Now, we could be witnessing just another of capitalism's recurring crises. Joseph Schumpeter regarded creative destruction as the process of industrial mutation that increasingly and incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, constantly destroying the old one, consistently creating a new one. It was the state's job to absorb the dislocations in the economic sphere. Biden's industrial strategy may be an attempt to establish a new American equilibrium, a form of 21st century managed capitalism. However, what if, contra Schumpeter, the crisis is no longer simply internal to the economic system, but undermines the external conditions of existence, social reproduction, the Earth's ecology, and political power and legitimacy? Nancy Fraser helpfully describes capitalism as a total social institution instead of simply an economic system. This characterization enables her to link capitalism to the social, ecological, and political conditions needed to sustain the economic system. Under capitalism, the great bulk of care and planning that goes into daily and generational reproduction of human and social life largely takes place beyond the market, in the family, the community, and in public institutions. Capitalism also assumes a sharp division between a natural realm, conceived of as offering a free, unproduced supply of raw materials that is available for appropriation and exploitation, and an economic realm understood as a sphere of value produced for and by human beings. Capitalism also depends upon public powers to establish and enforce the rules of the system. Without a legal framework underpinning the market, capitalism is inconceivable. In the public sphere of politics and law, democracy and equality rule, while in the economic realm, what you own is all that matters. The legal systems of imperial states established the contours of seemingly depoliticized arenas within which private actors could pursue their economic interests, free from overt political interference. Territorial states also mobilized legitimate force to put down resistance to the expropriations through which capitalist property relations were originated and sustained. Although these realms of life are governed by different sets of institutions and processes than govern economic activity, they are only semi-autonomous. Money is the device that communicates between these different systems, and accumulation is its dynamic. Because capitalism's drive for accumulation is insatiable, it constantly extends its logic into the social, ecological, and political spheres needed to sustain it. At its core, capitalism's relationship to social reproduction, nature, and politics is contradictory and crisis-prone. The pandemic has clearly revealed the contradiction between social reproduction and capitalism. The impending climate disaster spotlights the contradiction between accumulation and nature, and the turn to authoritarian ethno-nationalism shows how corporate power and unregulated social media have distorted the political process. Now, given my dire portrait of the contemporary situation and my depiction of capitalism as a total social institution, what is labor law's role? I am interested in identifying the problem that is producing the morbid symptoms, declining union density, increasing inequality, the shrinking protection of labor law and the social safety net. And I am confident that others at the conference can come up with normative solutions. In their magisterial report for the European Commission, The Transformation of Work and the Future of Labor Law, Alain Soupiot and colleagues identified the challenges labor law faced at the cusp of the 21st century. How was labor law to respond to the transformation of work, the growth of self-employment, outsourcing, and subcontracting? This influential report argued for labor law to respond to this social transformation by extending beyond employment to occupational status and rejuvenating collective representation. Labor law would be reinforced by social rights backed by the state. Just as work has transformed since the 1940s, labor law has metamorphosized. In their 2005 collection, The Transformation of Labor Law in Europe, Bob Heppel and Bruno Vientiani charted how labor law in 15 countries had changed from 1945 to 2004 to respond to the changing social condition. Their volume depicted the increasing fragmentation of labor law with the shift from collective bargaining and collective law to individual human rights and labor standards. These important contributions focus on the transformation of labor and the transformation of labor law as an adaptive mechanism. But I am much more concerned today with labor law's contribution to social transformation, by which I mean transformation of the kind Karl Polanyi wrote about in The Great Transformation, the triumph of industrial capitalism in the United Kingdom. Although Polanyi did not use Fraser's vocabulary, he understood that capitalism, which he called the market society, was a total institution. He argued that before the 19th century, the economic system had been conceived of as part of the broader society, governed by social customs and norms, as much as by market principles of profit and exchange. The rise of capitalism, however, involved political efforts to de-link the economy from this social environment, to, in Fraser's words, institutionally separate them, or in Polanyi's terms, to disembed the market from society. In the market society, basic aspects of social life, such as labor, land, and money, are commodified. These efforts to embed society in the market were, Polanyi warned, bound to fail. Like Fraser, he saw the contradiction as one between the economic system and its preconditions, the political system, nature, and social reproduction. What was the role of law in this epochal change that led to industrial capitalism? Work by Zoe Adams, Nate Holdren, Eric Tucker, and Chris Tomlins, to name a few, is helpful to me for answering this question. They distinguish between the abstract role of law in capitalism and labor law's specific mediation at historical conjunctures. At an abstract level, law, its norms, and institutions are part of the architecture of capitalism. The rule of law, private property, and contract were critical to capitalism's reproduction and expansion. They are the essential legal background conditions for capitalism. Law maintains the deep structures of the economy, responds to recurring regulatory dilemmas inherent to capitalism, helps to preserve the separation between the different social spheres, and frames the debate upon terms upon which the political debate can occur. The contract of employment is the critical legal device providing for the commodification of labor. In the sphere of circulation, the worker is free to quit and contract with another employer. In political economy, neoclassical economics, and contract law, the voluntariness of the exchange is the distinctive feature of free labor, and consent is the regulative ideal. The assumption is that the labor market is an arena of free exchange in which legally equal parties contract to their own mutual advantage. The law simply provides neutral rules of the game. Meanwhile, the state's role should be to ensure a level playing field between market actors. It is almost impossible for law to engage with the deep level of the economic structure. If, however, we move from the abstract level of the role of law in capitalist societies to examine labor law at specific times and places, we see that labor law emerges out of the struggle over surplus and subsistence. Labor's law's role is to mediate this competition by addressing the inequality of bargaining power between workers and their employers. Labor law is supposed to protect workers from employers' superior bargaining power. Now, the extent to which labor law does this reflects class power. Once we see labor law as the outcome of struggle, we can also appreciate why its scope is so spatially and temporally limited. It rests on a particular class compromise forged in specific countries during a specific period. It is important not to forget that in 1939, a handful of European nations dominated 40% of the world's territory. Labor law was not devised by subaltern workers in the colonies. They were out of the picture. They were excluded. It was the product of mass industrial and political mobilization in a few key states in a context in which the Soviet Union was a countervailing power. The standard employment relationship and managed capitalism was the high water mark in the mediation of the contradictions between capitalism and its preconditions. This mediation, however, excluded most of the post-colonial world and, of course, all of the world under the Soviet Union. Labor law's focus on distribution and its role in mediating these recurring tensions distracts from another deeper problem. While at the level of exchange, the employer and worker contract as equals, when it comes to the actual relationship, as every labor lawyer knows, the worker is subordinate to the employer. Subordination, not freedom, characterizes the hidden mode of production. The duty of the employee to obey the employer's orders is implied by law into every contract of employment. It's not a matter of bargain. Employers exercise a great deal of control over working people's lives, and it is the daily dullness of this subordination that makes self-employment so appealing to most people. Being one's own boss is about self-determination, but the absence of a human manager may not guarantee self-government. Algorithms used by platforms in the gig economy clearly control workers. So what does my two-part analysis reveal about the role of labor law when it comes to social transformation? Generally, labor law is an adaptive but not transformative mechanism, and the extent of its adaptation depends on the balance of power between social forces. How then can labor lawyers contribute to social transformation and not simply to adaptation? Let's take the example of platform-mediated gig work, which has received a great deal of attention from labor lawyers. The judicial system has been slow, although it has begun to adapt to geographically tethered platform-mediated gig work. Legislation is also beginning to move the goalposts when it comes to classifying these workers for the purposes of employment protection. But labor law cannot even begin to address the underlying problem, which is the extent of market concentration in cloud services and computing providers. According to the International Labour Organization's 2021 flagship World Employment and Social Outlook report, a few large multinational enterprises such as Alibaba, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and Tencent, which are geographically concentrated in China and the United States, dominate the sector. The estimated annual revenue of these 7 companies combined for 2019 was about $1,000 billion US. These giants own several of the leading digital labor platforms, which are small in comparison. Digital labor platforms are financed through venture capital funding, which has allowed labor platform companies to expand rapidly and compete with traditional sectors despite often being unprofitable. This financing model has enabled large platform companies to acquire global market dominance, which could further widen the digital divide and increase economic inequality on a global scale. Labor law solutions that advocate clear terms of engagement, transparency in working ratings, and social protection are important mediations, but they simply adapt to the underlying problem, which is the unbelievable concentration of power and wealth in a few hands. Now, of course, this is not a new problem. In 1929, during the Great Depression, Big Bill Hayward, a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, declared, "The barbarous gold barons, they did not find the gold. They did not mine the gold. They did not mill the gold, but by some weird alchemy, all the gold belonged to them." The same is true today. The economic system should provide the background conditions for social reproduction, the polity, and nature, and not the other way around as it does today. This is the fundamental problem with our form of capitalism, and it needs to be confronted head on. It's crucial now, I think, for labor lawyers to engage in critique as much as mediation. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Pamachai Bamu, who is based in Zimbabwe. Pamachai is the law program coordinator in Africa for women in informal employment, globalizing and organizing, WAEGO. Her work focuses on legal issues covering precarious and vulnerable workers, including domestic workers and street vendors. She's going to pick up the theme of COVID, which Tom's highlighted, and she'll speak to us today on entrenching inequality or breaking with the past, lessons from African countries' regulation of informal workers under COVID-19. Pamachai, welcome. It's over to you.
Good morning and good evening or good afternoon, colleagues, depending on where in the world you are. Firstly, I'd like to apologize for that glitch. I don't know what was happening, but on my end, everything seemed to be fine. Where I come from in Africa, when things like this happen, people usually say it's a sign that someone doesn't want you to be on this platform and is sabotaging you. I'm currently based in the United States, even though I'm from Zimbabwe. So it's morning here, and I wish you a good day. And thank you to the organizers for having me here. So I'm going to speak about self-employed workers and access to social protection, and the lessons that we are learning from Africa and really from all over the world. But I'm going to focus on work that we've been doing in WeGo, where we work with street vendors in particular, amongst other sectors. And we're looking at research that WeGo has done, firstly in the context of the COVID crisis and informal workers study. It's a 12-city study of cities around the world, looking at the impact of COVID, as well as research that we've done in the context of a project that is being supported by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and incorporates WeGo, the African Platform for Social Protection, and the International Trade Union Confederation Africa. So it's a very practical looking at the grounded realities of some of the issues that we've been looking at. And I'm grateful that Professor Judy Fudge has given the framework and the background, which speaks to a lot of what I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. Okay, so the overview is I'm going to just start briefly by talking about self-employed workers. And I'm framing the discussion in terms of the decent work agenda and the idea of rights-based social protection. And then I'm going to talk about what we are learning during this COVID-19 pandemic and looking at possibilities for extending social protection to self-employed workers. And social protection in this regard is we're looking more closely at social insurance in particular, because that is what we associate with labor law. And when I say labor law in this context, I'm broadly speaking about the law that regulates work, collective labor relations, individual labor law, as well as the social insurance that is organized around work that people do. Next slide, please. So if we were to look at informal employment based on the last study of men and women in the informal economy 2018, we see that globally it's just over 60% of workers who are in informal employment. And in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm from, we are at close to 90%. Asia and the Pacific, just over 70%. Latin America and the Caribbean, it's about 54%. And the goldish, bronzish color there signifies the proportion of those workers in informal employment who are self-employed. And that really shows how significant the extent to which people are in self-employment is across the world, and particularly in our developing regions. Next slide, please. So self-employed workers, in terms of our definition, are people who own and operate economic units. And in this presentation, I'm speaking more about those who are own account workers, so those that work on their own account, as opposed to workers who have what we'd call a notional employer. So we're not talking about people in platform work, people who are outsourced and so on, where the employment, the employment relationship may be disguised, but there is the possibility of pinning employer obligations to a party. But we're talking about somebody who works for themselves, for their own livelihood and profit. And we're also not talking about people who are employers. So in the slide that I showed you, the statistics, those that are not self-employed as defined include waged workers, employers, and unpaid family workers. But employers amongst, in the proportion of informal employment, actually account for a very, very small percentage of that. So we're not talking about micro-enterprise in that sense, but people that work for themselves and largely by themselves. Thank you. Looking at self-employed workers and social protection, it's very important to underscore the fact that they are workers that are in very, very precarious situations. So they're workers in many situations who are earning a very low income, have limited assets and limited savings to fall back on. In many cases, their livelihoods are really on a hand-to-mouth sort of basis. So, you know, it's every day counts, every hour counts, every sale or every transaction counts, because if you're not able to work for a day or two, that has serious consequences for your livelihood, for your household income, for your family's well-being. So it's very important to underscore that. And as workers, they're vulnerable to unemployment, where they're not able to work for long periods of time, to injury, to illness, which may be related to the nature of their work and their working conditions. They also need protection in cases of maternity. So we have women who become mothers and need to take time off work to recover, take care of the baby. And when it comes to old age also, it's a big challenge, because if they do not have pension savings, then in many cases, excuse me, they have to continue to work for long periods because they don't have any other source of income. And of course, death. So if a street vendor dies, or if a waste picker dies, for example, we're in a situation where the family is in a very difficult position because they're not able to to get the support that they were receiving from that person who was the breadwinner. And when we look at how self-employed workers fit within the framework of social insurance law currently, which is labor law because it's framed around the world of work, the exclusion of self-employed workers is actually rooted in the legislation. So much of the legislation speaks to an employer and an employee. So that employment relationship is usually the foundation and the bedrock of inclusion and social protection. And those who are self-employed, like the street vendors, like the waste pickers, actually are unable in many cases to participate. The contributions are made by the employer and the employee. And so when a person is self-employed and working on their own account, as I've said, it is not possible for there's no corresponding party to make the co-contributions to that fund. And so there are challenges as to how the benefits and the contributions can actually be made. In some countries in Africa, we have people who are, the laws actually allow for self-employed workers to be included on a voluntary basis. So it's not a compulsory membership as it is in the case of a person who is an employee, but it's a voluntary, you can be included on a voluntary basis. And in many cases, that legislation says that the self-employed worker is responsible for the co-contribution that an employer would have made. And where we're talking about workers who have low earnings, who have unstable income, it's actually difficult to reconcile inclusion on the basis that one not only pays their own contribution, but has to make a double contribution, as it were. So this is the challenge that we find most of the workers that we are talking about actually face when they're seeking and in need of social protection. Next slide, please. So here's a self-employed worker in Johannesburg who pretty much goes from door to door in residential areas and salvages and reclaims pieces of recyclable material and sells them on, usually to middle men and women, and is able to earn a livelihood in that way. And this is something that many workers are doing in different parts of the country and different parts of the continent. And there are different models and different ways in which waste pickers are operating, but he's working in the residential areas. Others work in landfill sites and so on. Next slide, please. So in talking about the inclusion of self-employed workers and workers who are marginalized from labor law broadly defined, one of the overarching frameworks that has been very important and instructive is the ILO Decent Work Agenda, which I think the genesis can be traced back to the ILO Director General at the time, Juan Somavia's report, which spoke about this idea and this ideal of decent work. And decent work, as you know, encompasses 4 pillars, of which social protection is one. And the idea of speaking about decent work is that it's not work that should be reserved for certain privileged workers, but it is decent work should be for all workers. So it embraces all work, whether they're organized or not, wherever the work may occur. So on a public space, in a factory, on a farm, in the household, everywhere. And whether this work is in the informal or the informal economy. And the idea and the notion of decent work then started to influence and reorient how the ILO was working, how priorities were set, how countries were operating. And, you know, the decent work country programs came into effect. And national policies and national laws speak about this idea of decent work, the ideal of decent work, and it's been incorporated into the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And before we got there, really, there was also the resolution concerning decent work in the informal economy, which was adopted at the ILC in 2002, which is also very important for framing and identifying who is in the informal economy and what the agenda should be in terms of ensuring that decent work is realized within the informal economy. And I would make the argument around the decent work agenda that we could say decent work is so ubiquitous and it has become so ingrained in labor law, policy labor law, framework labor law conversations. And we could argue that it is becoming something of customary international law because it is in the practice. And because it comes from really the foundational principles and the Philadelphia Declaration and so on, it's something that is tied to membership within the ILO. It's not something that you can do if you want to. It's something that really should inform the work that member states are doing in terms of ensuring that workers are protected in that context. So decent work is a very, very important concept. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have the key ILO instruments on social protection. There are many, but just to highlight the ILO Convention on Social Security Minimum Standards, which sets out, the key risks, the ways in which social insurance should be framed and extended to workers, and importantly, the ILO Recommendation on Social Protection Floors of 2012, which speaks about the inclusion of workers in the informal economy and talks about the right to social protection and realizing that, as well as the ILO recommendation on the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And that recommendation number 204 also speaks to the importance of extending social protection to workers in the informal economy, broadly speaking, whether self-employed, whether in disguised and different employment relationships, atypical forms of work, and so on. So these instruments really speak to the idea that social protection is not only for formal workers, but should be extended to workers in the informal economy. Next slide, please. So here's a waste picker who's based in Durban, and she works out of a landfill site, and basically they collect their recyclables and they use these bags when they're storing their goods and on selling them to the middlemen who buy them and sell them onto companies that use them. Next slide, please. So rights-based social protection is another framework or another way of looking at social protection. And there are many debates around labor rights versus human rights. I won't go into them here, but to say that I think there are very, very good arguments to underpin the idea of complementarity between labor rights and human rights. Yes, they are different and there are different approaches to realizing them and working with them, but they're not mutually exclusive. And even within the context of the work that the ILO does, this endorsement of a rights-based approach, particularly to social protection, is very, very much there within the instruments, within the programs, and so on. And if we look at the international and regional instruments that speak to this idea of a right to social protection, we have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is now customary international law. We have the International Convention on Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is widely ratified, as well as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, very widely ratified, particularly in my continent, Africa, which is a good thing. And we also have the AU Charter and protocols. Different sub-regions also speak to social protection, and these are binding instruments on member states that have ratified them. And the African Union, importantly, is now drafting a standalone protocol on social protection, which will be a binding instrument, because as it currently stands, the social protection obligations in terms of binding instruments are scattered around different instruments. And this is comprehensive, and it speaks to the informal economy, rights within the informal economy as well. So the recognition of social protection as a human right, and this being a right for everyone, including self-employed workers. And if you look at the interpretations of some of the authoritative bodies, the treaty bodies, for example, and the CACR, they speak to this idea that it should be extended to workers who are, to people who do not enjoy social protection, who have been excluded from social protection, which is very important. And it's linked to different rights: the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to equality, and non-discrimination. And non-discrimination also includes protection from discrimination on the basis of your status in employment, the kind of work that you do. So this idea really underpins how important and how fundamental the right to social protection is. And we have a really exciting example that many of you may have come across, where this rights-based approach to social protection came into the courts in South Africa. It wasn't about a self-employed worker, but it was about a domestic worker who died at work and was not able to, and her family needed support, and they challenged the workers' compensation law on the basis that it excluded it excluded domestic workers. And the court really emphasized this notion of the right to social protection and struck down this provision that excluded domestic workers. Next slide, please. So what are we learning from COVID? We did this study that I explained, and we looked at the COVID laws of 39 Anglophone and Francophone countries. And what we noticed is that law has been used as a tool to regulate movement, to regulate work, to regulate the conduct of people. But hardly has it been used as a tool to extend protection in terms of social protection. So where there have been relief and other forms of protection, they have largely been, and social assistance, they have largely been extended in the context of programs, plans, policies, and non-binding kinds of instruments. In a few cases, we've had laws that have actually spoken about social protection. Informal food vendors have been recognized as essential workers, and this is very important because it just underscores the need to include these workers that play a very important socio-economic roles. But many self-employed workers have been unable to work for various reasons, including how the movements and work and so on have been regulated. And one of the big dilemmas have been for many workers: should I stay at home if I'm not allowed to work or I cannot go to work? Or should I starve? So many have actually decided, look, I'd rather go out and work, even if it's dangerous, even if I could be arrested, rather than stay at home and starve. Next slide, please. So that's a market trade in Ghana. New rules, new regulations, masks, and so on are important. Next slide, please. So for many under COVID, employees were able to access benefits in many of the countries. So they were able to access unemployment, workers' compensation, maybe if they contracted the illness, and death benefits may be associated with the COVID pandemic. But for self-employed workers, many of them could not rely on social protection. We have some limited examples where in Ghana and Kenya, workers were able to withdraw parts of their savings, so saving pockets, short-term savings pockets from their pension funds, in light of the fact that they were not able to work in some cases. And many workers, self-employed workers, had to rely on social assistance, on relief, on charity to be able to survive. And the idea of returning to work, so the end of lockdowns didn't necessarily mean the end of that workers could immediately go back into their work. For many, maybe they'd sold their assets, they had used their stock, or they'd gotten rid of the stock, disposed of their stock while they were not able to work. So returning to work, it's not a light that you flip and people are able to go back into the workplace. For many, they actually didn't have the assets and they didn't have anything to begin their work again. And importantly, the issue of social dialogue. There has been a lot of exclusion of informal workers' organizations in national debates or national discussions about how the COVID pandemic should be dealt with. In many cases where they were included, it was at a local level in discussing what health and safety and other mechanisms should be put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But in Africa in particular, there was a lot of collaboration with trade unions, where trade unions maybe had a platform and brought informal workers in or spoke about the interests of informal workers. And that is something that we need to be mindful of. And when it comes to recovery plans, one thing that is encouraging is that more and more countries are speaking about this idea of extending social protection to those who have been excluded. But in many cases, the discussions have happened without informal workers' organizations in the room. It's quite scandalous, if you ask me, because these are the very people, as you saw from the figures, who are the backbone of the labor force, but they are not included in these very critical conversations. Moving on to, just as I conclude. So the recommendations for extending social protection. I think the one thing that we need to really think about more and more, and that many people have spoken to, is this idea of the socio-economic context and the grounded realities and where we are getting our inspiration from. As Africa, we have inherited our labor law frameworks from our colonizing countries, and we've often looked for inspiration to these systems. And if we look at the labor markets and the structure of the labor markets, often we can see that there are very vast differences in who is vulnerable as a worker. So, I mean, we do have issues around platform work, atypical forms of employment, but paid employment in many, or paid waged employment in many of these countries accounts for 10 to 25% of the workforce. And for many people, they're self-employed. So we need to think about how our labor law can be fashioned and adapted to the grounded realities that it includes these workers. And amongst the questions are, should informal workers, the self-employed workers, be included in existing schemes or separate schemes? There are good arguments for and good arguments against. Including them in existing schemes allows for the cross-subsidization of funds with informal workers and formal workers, whereas separate schemes oftentimes narrow the pool and provide for a much smaller fund that is likely to be unsustainable in the long run, although there are ways to bring in co-contributions and so on into those separate schemes. There are also attempts in some countries to introduce adaptations to registration requirements, adaptations to contributions, how they're calculated, the levels of contributions, and how these contributions are made. So in Kenya, for example, they actually speak about mobile money. The law actually speaks about mobile money being a way for workers, self-employed workers, to make their payments, how payments are made, and so on. And the idea also of co-contributions by the state or another third party, this is also very important to boost the funds and to boost the benefits that workers will be able to access. This has happened in Rwanda, for example, where the government actually makes co-contributions by incentivizes self-employed workers to save and makes co-contributions when they reach a certain level. And it's important maybe when people say there's not enough money, we need to think about how informal workers, self-employed workers, street vendors, waste pickers and so on are contributing to public revenue by doing the work that they're doing and paying fees and so on for actually operating. This is an important source of revenue, and one needs to consider not only using that money for infrastructure, but using it to contribute towards social protection. So savings incentives, I've spoken to that. And then long-term versus short-term savings is also another thing to consider. I spoke about the Ghana and Kenya examples where you may have a long-term savings pocket, so a pension plan, for example, that also has a short-term savings pocket. So one can save money and after a certain period, access those funds and maybe use it to buy new stock or to buy equipment and so on that the worker requires. So this may be another way of incentivizing workers to go into social protection. And this is in the Ghanaian pension law allows for this. And very, very importantly, social dialogue and ensuring that informal workers organizations are included. This is included in the National Social Security Fund Act of Kenya. So there are these examples that are inspiring, that are really encouraging us to see that labor law, social protection law is being refashioned and adapted to the needs of informal workers. And then here's a question about room for court challenges. I alluded to the case of the Mahlangu decision. There may be space in which to actually challenge some of the laws that exclude self-employed workers on the basis that they violate the rights to social protection and other laws that other rights that I've mentioned. Next slide. Okay, there's a street vendor in Durban. You can skip to the next slide. And I think there's so much that different parties can do. Informal workers organizations really want to be part of the conversations. Trade unions are allies to informal workers and not competitors, and actually need to be supporting and rallying behind informal workers in social dialogue and on all platforms. Governments also need to increase spending on social protection and think about new and innovative ways to bring informal workers into the net. Civil society can also promote the visibility of informal workers, work on advocacy to align the laws to these ideals, decent work and rights-based social protection. And researchers, we have an important role in identifying gaps and developing new paradigms and recommendations for alignment. At this juncture, I'd like to thank you very much. Apologies for going a little bit over time, but thank you so much for this opportunity. And I hope that the deliberations going forward are very fruitful and thought-provoking.
Thank you very much indeed. It's great to end with a multifaceted agenda for building back better. And on that note, I'm going to pass back to Isabella and Marta to conclude this marvelous opening ceremony. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tonya. On behalf of all the members of the local organizing team, we would really like to thank you all for such thought-provoking speeches of all kinds today. And we are really looking forward to tomorrow. But before we get there, let us leave you with a cheer-up movie, which is a proof of not only a newly acquired by Isabella video editing skills, but most importantly, it's a footage of a really unique LLRN community spirit that was there for us for the whole organizational process for more than 2 years, and hopefully it will be with us during the next 2 days. So thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much.